In the city of brotherly love, what happens when power and ambition collide within the mafia? Welcome to James Proctor Mob Stories. We have a great show lined up for you guys today, and I'm excited to be here. In this episode of Revelations, we dive into the violent struggle that reshaped the Philadelphia Mafia, pitting the established boss John Stanfa against the ambitious upstart Joey Merlino and his Young Turks. The third and final Philly mob war was deadly and resulted in the demise of a once stable family. From the shot heard round the world to brother going up against brother, we'll go through all the events which culminate in the old guard being disposed and a new charismatic boss taking the reins. This war was similar to other mob wars, but is also unique, with New York being taken down by Rico and its own war involving the Colombo crime family. New York just chose not to intervene, and they let the established boss they put in power, John Stanfa, take on the Young Turks alone. Who would have thought that Joey Merlino and the Young Turks, which consisted of mostly boyhood friends, stood a chance? But what they lacked in experience, they made up in their ability to keep the fight going even with losing key members to gangland slayings and law enforcement. This is a story of how Joey Merlino became the boss of the Philly crime family. Stay with us as we unravel a tale of betrayal, ambition, and the fight for control. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. John Stanfa, as we mentioned in our episode on the rise of Joey Merlino, wasn't from Philadelphia. He was brought into the family as a favor for Carlo Gambino. John Stanfa had moved to the United States from Sicily, originally settling in New York, where he had family members, and then he moved to Philadelphia, where he was basically a personal gopher for the boss at the time, Angelo Bruno. When Bruno gets whacked, John Stanfa ended up going to Baltimore, hiding out until he gets picked up by authorities. He spends 8 years in prison, and when he gets out, John Gotti, who's the boss of the Gambino family, made a power move. And this move was to influence Philly, and he pushed the commission to accept this relatively unknown John Stanfa as boss in 1991, replacing the violent psychopath Nicky Scarfo Sr., who was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. While in prison, Joey Merlino meets Ralph Natal. He was a longtime associate of the Philly crime family, controlling the local bartenders union, and he's a big dealer of drugs. They plied to take over the family from this outsider Stanfa. So why was there a problem between the Young Turks and John Stanfa? There are a few reasons that Stanfa's appointment as boss caused friction in the Philly mob. One, the repeated intrusion of the New York families. This was a guy who was hailing from Italy and settling under the Gambino protection. Stanfa was seen as not having worked his way up the Philly mob hierarchy and didn't have an understanding of the territory the same way as the Philly-born members did. Joey Merlino was from a birth family with connections to the wider Philly mob. He was son to Scarfo's underboss and the brother to Maria Merlino, who was briefly engaged to Salvatore Testa before they broke it off. He was also friends with made men, the Ciancaglini brothers, Michael and Joseph, whom he met during his high school years. You also had Stanfa trying to gain control of the bookmaking and gambling rackets of the Young Turks, and allegedly one of Merlino's uncles was extorted by Stanfa, and that didn't go over very well. This wasn't Merlino's first rodeo. In 1989, when Nicky Scarfo tried to run the family from his prison cell, it's alleged the Young Turks shot his son, Nicky Scarfo Jr., 8 times in Bella Vista, Philadelphia. Even though Nicky Jr. survived and no one was ever charged with the murder, it sent a direct message to Scarfo, especially when the gunman deliberately dropped the gun that night, and this was reminiscent of the Godfather movie, which happened to be Scarfo's favorite movie. While in prison, Merlino and Ralph Natal hatched up their plan to seize control of the family from Stanfa. But there were other key conspirators in this plot. You had Michael Ciancaglini, Stephen Mazzone, George Borghese, Gaetano Scafidi, and Martin Angelina. The rebellious Merlino faction, they would be dubbed by the press as the Young Turks. A fascinating part of Joey Merlino's life in the mob were the people around him. Here are 5 of his childhood friends he grew up with that was part of the life. When we talk about the Young Turks who opposed the old guard of John Stanfa, we have to remember that many of them grew up with Joey in South Philly, and that was part of the reason he had a lot of loyalty on the streets. Most of them were like Joey and had fathers and uncles in that life. It's unfortunate that many of his childhood friends died, turned to the feds, or betrayed Joey personally. It just shows you how treacherous that life is, and that loyalty's not always two ways. However, a big reason Joey Merlino made it on top in Philly was his group of friends he grew up with. Stanfa was well aware of the divide in the Philly mob, and to appease Merlino's faction, he appointed Michael's older brother Joseph Ciancaglini as his underboss. He was hoping that this would bring Merlino and his supporters under the wider banner of Stanfa's Philly mob, and by doing so avoid yet another bloody internal conflict. He also had Joey Merlino inducted as a made member of the Philly crime family. However, this did very little to ease tension. In 1992, another brutal civil war was fully in swing for control of the family, and this is known as the Third Philly Mafia War. The factions trade blows quickly and violently. Stanfa's loyal capo, Felix Bocchino, was murdered first, followed by a swift retaliation by Stanfa, who ordered the killing of Michael Ciancaglini, who was Merlino's right-hand man. The attempt on Ciancaglini's life failed, with Michael narrowly avoiding a hail of gunfire outside his home by diving inside and taking cover. The other Ciancaglini brother wasn't as fortunate. Having been appointed as Stanfa's underboss, young Joseph Ciancaglini found himself on the opposite side of this war to his brother. Can you believe this? So you have two brothers now fighting on opposite sides of the war. In 93, Joseph was shot allegedly by 3 Merlino faction gunmen while managing his restaurant in South Philadelphia. We had done a short of this shooting as is considered the first mob hit caught on tape, as a restaurant was being bugged by the feds. While Joseph didn't die, he was left in a vegetative state by the brutal attack. The Merlino faction delivered a devastating blow to Stanfa with Joseph's shooting. Stanfa didn't wait to strike back. He sent gunmen to kill Merlino himself. So we go to August of 93. Michael Ciancaglini and Merlino are exiting a social club. You have a car that pulls up next to him, and the occupant starts opening fire. So Merlino was shot twice in the ass, and he walked away injured but alive. Michael, however, wasn't lucky enough to cheat death a second time, being shot in the upper torso, going through an artery. He died at the hospital. Not even a month later, a drive-by shooting was performed on Stanfa and his son. Driving on the expressway, a van pulled up beside Stanfa's car and unleashed a hail of bullets. Stanfa escaped uninjured, but his son was shot in the jaw, only surviving as Stanfa's driver managed to lose the assailants and get them to a hospital. The Stanfa faction continued multiple attempts on Merlino's life, with Stanfa gunman Philip Coletti later testifying that he had planted numerous remote-control bombs under Merlino's car, but none of them went off. So by November of 93, Merlino was sent back to prison, charged with violating his supervised release by association with known felons. So with Merlino in jail, does this mean that Stanfa's faction would win? Although both sides had lost key members in the war, and Merlino was now back in prison, Stanfa was still unable to wrest control of the Philly mob. You have to understand the tactical errors that Stanfa was making. He didn't have New York to back him up because New York was dealing with its own problems, as both John Gotti had been put in prison and Chin Gigante, the Genovese boss, was facing indictments. The Colombo family was in its own bloody war. And Philly just wasn't important anymore. Times had changed. Even with Merlino in prison, he had support by young mobsters from the neighborhood who knew the neighborhood. Stanfa, however, struggled to find the manpower within the Philly mob, as many were serving long prison sentences or were killed after the Scarfo era. In a terrible move, Stanfa began recruiting criminals and hitmen who weren't of Italian heritage, and this broke a long-standing mafia tradition. He did this to maintain control of the organization and fight the ongoing war against Merlino's faction. Two of the individuals that Stanfa tied himself to were the Vesey brothers, John and William. John Vesey would be the one who was intrinsic in dismantling Stanfa and his control over the Philly mob. In 1994, Stanfa and 23 of his associates were indicted on multiple charges, from loan sharking and labor racketeering to murder. This came within 7 years of the indictment of Scarfo and his associates, so this was a second federal indictment of the Philly mob in 7 years. Stanfa's indictment holds the title of the largest prosecution of organized crime in Philadelphia history. Unfortunately for Stanfa, he had no chance in beating the case, as there were 2 years of recordings taken of Stanfa was explicitly discussing mafia business with mobsters in both his attorney's and doctor's office. Stanfa thought that confidentiality would protect him from anything he said, but the FBI had obtained a warrant to bug both places. Once everybody heard the evidence, Stanfa's men began to squeal. The Vesey brothers agreed to testify against John Stanfa. On the day of Stanfa's trial beginning in 1995, William Vesey, who was scheduled to testify against Stanfa, was murdered. A similar fate almost took out John Vesey, but he escaped, and he gave the authorities information that secured Stanfa and 20 of his men convictions. In July of 1996, Stanfa was sentenced to life imprisonment, which he serves today. So what happens to the Merlino faction now? Well, in 1994, Merlino was released from prison to take his place as the leader of the Philly mob. However, he decides to do something radically different, reminiscent of what the Genovese family is known for. He names Ralph Natal, who is also out of prison, as a new boss while positioning himself as Natal's underboss. However, make no mistake, Joey Merlino was no doubt the real power. So why would Joey Merlino make such an arrangement? Simply as a brilliant move. It allowed the attention to be on Ralph Natal while Joey could pull the strings away from law enforcement eyes. Reflecting on the legacy of the Stanfa-Merlino War, it's interesting to see what's happened to the Philly family now 30 years later. In my opinion, the Philly crime family is just a shell of itself. Joey went back to prison for 12 years, and many of his friends also went to prison. New York has continued to stay out of the affairs of Philadelphia, while Philly, as of now, doesn't even have a crew in Atlantic City, which in the 70s and 80s was the biggest moneymaker for the family. The Philly crime family still is in existence, but new indictments just the past couple of years has hurt the family further. Regarding Joey Merlino, he says he's no longer in that life, and that he's not the boss of the family. He spends his time between Florida and Philadelphia, while now having the Skinny with Joey Merlino podcasts. There's a lot you can learn from the Stanfa-Merlino War. For me, it shows a big mistake putting a guy that didn't know Philadelphia in as boss. Stanfa, to me, had no chance to win this war. It's like a football game with two opponents. The one with home field advantage has the better odds. Stanfa had never even been in the position of leadership or authority before being made boss by New York. Everybody underestimated the Young Turks. Merlino and his faction knew the territory, and they were young and hungry. War is a young man's game, and when Stanfa started using non-Italians in key positions within his faction, he made his biggest mistake, as the people he brought in were hired guns. They had no allegiance to Stanfa or the family. Inevitably, they turned and became rats. Stanfa lost everything. Regarding Joey Merlino and his podcast, do you think that Joey will be on Patreon and YouTube a year from now? What do you think that he's on YouTube? Do you think that he's going to stay on the straight and narrow? Or is he going to get jammed up again? What are your thoughts on the Stanfa-Merlino War and its impact on the Philadelphia Mafia? Share your perspectives in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of organized crime. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always. Thanks, everyone.